You are a thought. Oh, no, no. Be nice. Be nice. So, we're finally covering the second half of Season 9. For those that don't remember, because it's been a very long time, I was very impressed with the majority of Season 9's first half. So, I walked into the second half cautiously optimistic, but optimistic nonetheless. So, let's see if that optimism paid off. Starting with Episode 14. While I initially dreaded the thought of watching this episode, I became much more hopeful after seeing the synopsis. If you were around for my very early days, you'll know that some of the few Pinkie Pie stories I actually liked were her micro-series issue and her Friends Forever issue with Princess Luna, mainly because they have Pinkie using her eccentric personality to help characters going through a personal crisis. Both stories used her quirks in a way that was productive. I was under the impression that The Last Laugh would do the same, and I'm happy to say that my impression was correct. This is the Pinkie that we need to see more often, and I wouldn't have been so harsh on her all these years if this was the level of quality that she brought to the table. I also really enjoyed the episode's handling of the factory. For a moment, I thought the writers were just gonna go for that tired old lesson of laughs can't be manufactured, they have to be organic. While there is an argument to be made for organic creativity, most depictions of this lesson in media tend to go to the extreme of saying that mass production is 100% bad. Hell, even MLP was guilty of this to a certain extent at least. Thankfully, this episode goes with a more nuanced approach. The issue wasn't the factory, but rather that Cheese wasn't in his ideal environment. He prefers to be out in the field, making people laugh face to face. This was honestly the perfect way to handle this conflict and also teaches an important lesson about knowing where you work best. Really, the only criticism I have is that there wasn't any reason for Pinkie to question her purpose. The actual conflict of this episode was about Cheese. One could argue that her questioning her purpose motivated her to go see him, but she already had a motivation. She was invited, and she likes Cheese. Really likes him, but we'll get to that when we get to that. In spite of that one hang-up, this was a very good episode that makes me wish that we got Pinkie Pie stories of this quality more often. That song fucking sucked though. Episode 15. This was yet another interesting episode due to the knowledge I had going into it. A lot of people in the fandom really didn't like this episode, but the fandom has had a history of very bad takes regarding Rainbow Dash-centric episodes. Particularly Stranger Than Fanfiction, 28 Pranks Later, and especially the mysterious Mare Duel. Suffice it to say, I walked into 246 grade thinking this fandom had cried wolf yet again. Turns out they did, but this time I can at least say that the source of the frustration is somewhat legit, said source being how Dash acted. On one hand, I was frustrated at her too. She was being a shit coach, there's no denying that, but what else were y'all expecting? Rainbow Dash has always been the type of pony to only care about what she cares about. Combine that with her being a total sports junkie and it only makes sense why she would put zero effort into being the cheer squad coach, especially when the job she actually wanted to do is staring her right in the face. She only opens herself up to other interests when she's either called out on it or put into a situation where she has no other choice.
But if you sympathize with the fandom's frustrations with Dash's behavior, why is that not a strike against the episode?
Well, the same reason why Pinkie's treatment of Mudbriar wasn't a strike against the Mod couple, or why Zephyr's laziness wasn't a strike against Flutterbrother. The characters in question got a major reality check in the third act, and they fixed their behavior accordingly. A common sentiment about this episode is that the best moment was Smolder calling Dash out on her BS, and I agree. It's almost as if Dash learning this lesson was the point of the entire episode. This scene is basically the exact opposite of Dash's scene with Scootaloo in Parental Guidance. She's being called out for something she's actually doing wrong. It seems to me that the real problem is that for some people, the severity of Dash's negligence wasn't worth the payoff of her finally learning her lesson. And all I can say to that is that if this is where your issues lie, just be honest about it instead of just saying Dash is out of character or that she doesn't learn her lesson. Because she isn't, and she does. While there is some overlap, there is a difference between an episode being uncomfortable and an episode being bad. If there's anything negative I could say, it's that I could do without the episode winking at the end by telling us that Twilight set all this up from the beginning. Someone needs to tell Hasbro that it's okay to let characters learn shit without being a pseudo puppet master. I guess this is supposed to be a nod to Twilight eventually taking Celestia's place, but time and place, guys. Episode 16. There's really not much to say here. This is a standard Twilight goes batshit crazy episode. which we already got earlier this season, so you know how these go by now. And if you've been watching the show for at least a couple seasons, chances are you already know how you feel about these kinds of episodes. For me personally, having Twilight know what it feels like to be me for 20 minutes is an extra bit of flavor. I pretty much spent the episode going,
"Oh, sorry, man.
I'm gonna tickle you again."
Wouldn't let that shit happen to me, though.
But as I said, standard Twilight goes batshit crazy episode. Episode 17. Damn, she is fine.
Sketchy!
Oh, right. Right off the bat, one thing that, zoom please, I liked about this episode was how much it was able to pack into 20 minutes without it feeling too dense. In spite of the sheer number of events that transpire in the episode, it never feels like too much is happening, and the story rolls along at just the right pace. As for the lesson, last season I brought up the notion that MLP is really good with lessons about communication between friends, and as long as those lessons about communication take a distinct form each time, I can't really call it rehashing. The Summer Sun Setback serves a dual purpose, teaching the lesson of letting your leader know when things aren't going as planned, and showing how much Twilight has learned to control her stress in situations like this. The decision Twilight's friends made not to tell her anything was wrong, but in character, like Rainbow Dash's behavior in 246 grade. Twilight does have a habit of panicking, and that ends up making things worse. But now, her friends learn that they can trust her to be more level-headed when similar problems arise in the future. It wasn't the best move to place this episode right after a Trivial Pursuit, which does hurt this episode's impact when looking at the season as a whole, but in isolation, it's a nice display of character growth. Episode 18. The fandom has had this weird hatred of Angel Bunny since season 1, and only now an episode comes out that completely justifies it. She Talks to Angel is one of those episodes where I like one thing about it, but everything else is a mess. What do I like about it? It's fucking hilarious. Angel trying to pass himself off as Fluttershy and simply not giving a fuck got consistent chuckles out of me. Where it falls flat is in the delivery of its moral. The episode's biggest weakness is that there's a disconnect between intent and execution. The episode's intent was for Angel and Fluttershy's problem to be two-sided, that they both equally contribute to this problem, but in execution, this is far from the case. While it is undeniable that Angel was being neglected, the vast majority of the mishaps that happened in this episode were either instigated or escalated by Angel. The episode wants you to believe that the root of this problem is a lack of mutual understanding between Flutters and Angel. The dialogue is very insistent on asserting that this is the case. But let's look at what Flutters and Angel learn about each other when switching bodies. All Fluttershy learns is that being small is difficult. Meanwhile, Angel learns that Fluttershy is extremely overworked between the school and the sanctuary, thus explaining why she never has time for him. Maybe that's what the real problem is. It's not that Fluttershy and Angel don't understand each other, it's that Angel doesn't understand Fluttershy. Solving Fluttershy's problem first would solve his, but not the other way around. And that's the gaping hole in this episode's assertion that the problem is mutual. So, knowing that, fixing this episode is simple. You make the episode's lesson one that Angel and only Angel has to learn. Also, this is yet another instance of using the one black-coded character as a plot device to solve someone else's problem, but I've talked about that at length before and I don't want to repeat myself. Speaking of episodes with a serious disconnect between intent and execution, episode 19. For this episode, I feel that I need to be a bit more serious here. No jokes, no sarcastic remarks, this is just me talking to you guys as a person. There were 2 times where MLP attempted to teach a general lesson in a misguided way that wanders into topics that the writers were not equipped to handle. For Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep? It was self-harm. For A Rock Hoof and a Hard Place? It was suicide. Dragon Dropped does this yet again, with the topic of an adult orbiting around a minor. I'm gonna take a moment to give you all a timestamp to the next episode in case the discussion of this topic makes you uncomfortable. I know people tend to forget this a lot, some of you even ignore it, but Rarity is an adult, and Spike is not. I'm not interested in debating whether he's a child or a teenager because the fact remains, he is not an adult. From the beginning of this episode, I was concerned that it would send some very bad implications if the writers weren't careful with their dialogue choices, and the storyboard artists weren't careful with the imagery they used. For the first half of the episode, I thought they were just walking the line. Then they started putting overtones of romantic jealousy in how they framed the montage in the second act. For a moment, I thought that maybe I was just projecting. Maybe I'm just taking recent happenings from within the fandom and projecting them onto the show. And then Rarity literally bribed Spike with convention tickets. I'm not saying that the writer of this episode intended to make this eerily disturbing parallel, but what I am saying is that he should have known better. And what baffles me is that all he had to do was not target these actions toward a child. Rarity's actions would still be problematic, but at least they wouldn't have been predatory, and it's not helped by the fact that she resists Twilight at first when she's told to stop. There have been episodes that annoyed me. There have been episodes that have made me angry. But there's never been an episode of MLP that's made me genuinely uncomfortable. As a person that has never been preyed upon as a child, this episode made me feel very uneasy, so I can only imagine what it would be like for someone that has actually gone through stuff like this. I know there will be people saying that I'm taking this too seriously, and that I shouldn't let bad implications ruin an episode, but here's something to keep in mind. You and I may have the luxury of being able to ignore these things and watch the pretty colors, but that doesn't mean that it's the responsible thing to do. A writer cannot be this tone deaf, especially when they're writing for a children's show, and there's no excuse for it. Period. And if you're willing to try and make an excuse for it, or play devil's advocate, then that just says a lot about you. With that being said, we're gonna move on to the next episode. Episode 20. Okay, all jokes aside, this episode had me worried at some parts, but it ended up sticking the landing. Starlight and Trixie were definitely a good choice to teach a lesson about not expecting your friends to favor you for a job or other such duties just because they're your friend. The main six know enough to understand this concept already, but since Starlight is a bit slow on the uptake and since Trixie is the type of person you have to be direct with in order to get her to understand something, these two were the ideal characters to teach this lesson to. One thing I definitely did not expect was for the episode to actually address the part Starlight played in making things worse than they needed to be. Trixie was practically telling her that she expected to get the job on favoritism alone, and it was clear that she believed Starlight was in on it. Trixie wasn't right to assume that this was the case, but when your friend makes it clear that they have the wrong impression and you see that and pass up several opportunities to set them straight, then you're partially to blame if things go too far, and the episode actually addresses this. We also established that the one thing Trixie is good at when it comes to the school is knowing when a child is not getting the help they need. I was a bit concerned when Trixie standing up for Gallus is treated like a mess up, but it's made explicitly clear that Starlight was mistaken in that judgment. And Gallus let Starlight know that he appreciated what Trixie did for him. Would I have preferred this conversation to happen on screen, especially with how little we see of the young six as it is? Yes. But at least they actually say that the conversation happened and leave no ambiguity for people to make bad takes, unlike other conflicts in the series. If we had better writers and there was room in the season, I would want Gallus's abuse to be addressed in a later season 9 episode. But since we just established that the writing staff in its current state has no business touching serious topics, I think it's for the best that we didn't get that. As it is, while a Horseshoe-In could have been better, I can still comfortably say that it was good. Episode 21. Okay, y'all really need to stop telling me which episodes I'm not gonna like, because this is the third time this season that you've been wrong, and plenty of times in previous seasons. Apparently the frustration seems to be centered around the redemptions of Cabaleron and Ahuizotl. I've historically given a scarce amount of shits regarding Dare and Do episodes, so these supposed redemptions have to be shadow play levels of terrible in order for me to care enough to dislike them. First off, the only character that gets redeemed is Cabaleron, because between him and Ahuizotl, Cabaleron is the only one that instigated confrontation. In every appearance Ahuizotl has had, he was acting in retaliation, so it boggles my mind that people think his portrayal here is a redemption at all, let alone a bad one. There's a difference between recontextualizing someone's actions and redeeming them. As for Cabaleron, the fact that some people thought I was gonna hate his redemption says to me that these people don't understand why I don't like most MLP redemptions in spite of how many times I've explained it. So let's walk through this step by step. The main thing I bring up when discussing bad redemptions are the severity and scale of their actions. When compared to terrorism, xenophobia-based child kidnapping, and hypnotizing people into joining a cult, actions that can destroy entire communities and even countries, Cabaleron's crimes simply do not compare. Another thing I bring up is that the redeemed villains in question usually have a sob story that's made to get sympathy from the viewer and justify their actions. Cabaleron does no such thing, and due to the aforementioned smaller severity and scale of his wrongdoings, seeing him want to be better is less of a jarring concept. If it was plausible for Discord to want to change after being shown kindness from Fluttershy, I don't see what makes Cabaleron worse than Discord. And like Discord, other characters rightfully doubt his capacity for change. I've said before in Garbled Priorities that there's a disturbing values dissonance when it comes to how this fandom reacts to redemptions like Cabaleron and Garbles versus redemptions like Tempest and Stygian's, and the reaction to Daring Doubt just reinforces my point. I think the biggest misstep here is that AK Yearling decides to go into business with Cabaleron. A better conclusion would be for the two of them to agree to leave each other alone, because they don't have to be the best of friends, just amicable. Because while Cabaleron's crimes don't compare to the likes of Tempest and Stygian, they were still bad enough for a business partnership to be out of the question for a long time at least. At best, Daring Doubt is okay. Like Garble, Cabaleron's redemption just needed a bit of tweaking here and there in order to be good. Again, it takes a lot for me to give a shit about Daring Do, but it's nowhere near the dumpster fire people were making it out to be. Episode 22. It's cute. This was a very straightforward CMC episode with a simple but important lesson for the target audience. Just because you're older doesn't mean you're smarter, and it's fitting that this episode aired during the last season of the show. Because it's so straightforward and the episode doesn't do anything outstandingly good or bad, there's not much to say other than that it teaches its lesson well by having the CMC learn it in a very literal way that gets the message across. The only critique I have is that this really shouldn't have been the last CMC episode. It would have been much more fitting for this episode and The Last Crusade to switch places in the lineup, or better yet, have The Last Crusade be the last episode before the finale. Speaking of the last episode before the finale, episode 23. There are two things I've gone on record saying. I love the framing device for the Saddle Row review, and Nay Anything is one of my favorite arcs of the comics, but I never would have thought to combine the two and apply the story to what's arguably become the second most prominent canon couple in the show. As I've reviewed this season, I've noticed that a lot of these episodes are basically better versions of bad episodes from the past, or in the case of Common Ground, they salvage a character from a bad episode. Sparkle 7 was what Slice of Life should have been. The Last Crusade was what Parental Guidance should have been. The Last Laugh was what Pinkie Pie should have been, and now the Big Mac question is what the perfect pair should have been. Admittedly, this episode does more for Big Mac than Sugar Belle since we've seen much more of the former than the latter, and ironically, the perfect pair had a similar issue with Pear Butter having to sacrifice more than Bright Mac. But even with the scarce amount of Sugar Mac episodes, it's still more than the Apple parents ever got. Because we have prior episodes to contextualize their relationship and prior characterization of at least one of the two characters, it's a lot easier to care about the proposal's success. Big Mac stepped out of his comfort zone to express his feelings in a way he felt was worthy of Sugar Belle, and it's very reminiscent of what Shining did for Cadence. Because Big Mac had previously been established as the type of person that's willing to step out of his comfort zone for someone he loves, this additional context makes the final moments of the episode a lot more meaningful. It's funny how Big Mac was so worried about his relationship being as good as his parents, when he and Sugar Belle were already leagues better without even trying. Episodes 24 and 25. Fellow MLP fans, we need to talk. See, one of the understandable consequences of me taking so long to watch and review this season is that I had a big twist of the finale spoiled for me. Said twist being that Discord was Grogar the whole time. A lot of fans didn't like this, with some even claiming that it ruined his character. Like most instances of fan outrage, I was naturally skeptical at the validity of this claim. But the one bit of sympathy I had was that I could understand why having this kind of twist can make one feel a bit sour. Having this kind of reveal happen in the third act would possibly leave me a bit miffed as well. At least, I was under the impression that this twist happened in the third act. The reactions definitely made it feel like that was the case with how much people harped on it. But then I finally watched the episode and it was literally the first thing they do, and the rest of the finale has Chrysalis, T-Rex, and Cozy Glow as its main villains. Henceforth, for the sake of brevity, I'll be referring to these three as the trio when I talk about them as a group. I don't want to just dismiss the fandom outright, but there comes a point where it starts to look like y'all just like being mad. But let's be fair here and go through my reasoning, starting with the betrayal itself. I talked about one of the downsides of being late to the season, but one of the upsides is that I can look at the episodes that set up the finale with the betrayal in mind and see if they adequately set it up. And they do. The trio never liked working under Grogar, and they only complied with his orders begrudgingly in the beginning. Then, a few episodes later, they made a pact to overthrow Grogar and take his power for themselves. On top of that, they also sowed the seeds of distrust amongst the ponies, something that only a villain that's been defeated by the power of friendship in the past would do, and it was clear that this would play into their endgame. The show was making it clear as day that the trio was going to jump Grogar once all the pieces were in place. So even if Grogar was the real Grogar, this betrayal still would have happened, and he would have been put out of commission regardless. And honestly, if I had to choose between the final baddie of the season being a trio of villains I'm familiar with that spent the season working together to become a powerful force, and some G1 callback that barely appeared throughout the season that I have no prior care or connection to, I'm gonna pick the former, every single time. Now, let's address what the finale does for Discord's character. Here's the thing. I will never understand why people continue to be surprised at Discord being on his bullshit. There's the claim that he hasn't learned anything from his redemption, but when you look at his reasonings for him being on his bullshit, that claim holds less water. At first, he uses his chaos magic for the sake of fucking with the main characters, or separating people he likes from people he perceives as a threat. Towards the end of the series, he's using it to save his friends, make the best impression, and rightfully retaliate towards someone that treated him like shit, while still not actively trying to harm her like she did to him later on. This not only shows an inherent change, but also establishes him as someone that's very short-sighted in spite of his vast power, just like another character that y'all love making excuses for when she fucks up. Considering how much the community likes to hyper-focus on intentions over actions, it's interesting that this belief completely evaporates once Discord enters the picture. With that said, I brought up that execution matters more than intention, and with that belief in mind, Discord is unequivocally wrong. He fucked up. But unlike other former villains that fuck up, he is rightfully and viciously chewed out once he tells everyone what he did, and the heroes rightfully take the piss out of him at every possible opportunity. It is only when he makes up for his mistake and puts his life on the line that they stop doing that to him. Now, it's one thing to be annoyed that Discord took this big of a risk. While this is an established part of his character, it's a particularly inflammatory part, and that's 100% valid. But saying that this is a betrayal of his character or ruins his character? Fuck out of here. With that being said, let's talk about the rest of the episode, cause it fucking slaps. I thought the premiere was fun and indulgent, but this is on a whole other level. The post-Scold roasting of Discord added that nice dash of comedy that I love, and Discord staring in Death's face just to talk shit to T-Rex?
You're right. Cretin is too polite.
Get
How
him.
about pathetic centaur?
Let him know.
Who uses magic to compensate for the fact that deep down
Talk to
he's
this
afraid
man.
he'll never be enough to please dear old dad. King Vor?
Comic reference! Boss moves. The issue of a child being petrified while grown adults that should have known better have gotten a slap on the wrist is a problem that weakens the episode for sure and warrants its own discussion in the future, but the episode for the most part is pure, unadulterated fun. I haven't enjoyed a finale this much since season 2, and this renewed enjoyment is symbolic of my view of the season as a whole. Even when the season reached its lowest point, arguably the lowest point of the entire series, the track record of the season's previous episodes made me optimistic that this low point was the exception and not the norm. Basically the opposite of how Sounds of Silence looks compared to most of season 8. I thoroughly enjoyed season 9, and it was a nice return to form for the series end.
You know there's still one more episode, right?
Wait, what? Episode 26. If you've seen the epilogue of any shonen anime or manga series, you've seen the last problem. It's something that people come to expect of any show, animated or live action, that's gone on for this long. Let's call a spade here. The episode is basically a victory lap for the writers. On the whole, it's alright. Not what I consider a favorite, but it's pretty inoffensive. Honestly, the episode's biggest flaw is how disjointed it feels. The writers made this odd decision of having the episode start with a flash forward, then immediately flash back to after the events of the previous episode, then go back and forth between the two time periods. Because of this, the structure of the episode is all over the place, and with how little time we spend in the future, it would have been better to just go through the events of Twilight's coronation, then have the episode end by transitioning to older Twilight telling her coronation story to her student as she's taking her to Ponyville. Had the episode prioritized telling the coronation story as its own thing rather than treating it as something to be told alongside the flash forward, would have made the last problem feel a lot less self-indulgent. I'll give it credit for one thing though. At least it didn't try to turn the flash forward into an entire season.
Well, aren't you mad about Applejack ending up with Dash and not Rarity?
If the writers were too chicken shit to explicitly say it on screen and say that they were leaving it up to interpretation off screen, especially when the straight couples are given no such ambiguity, then I have no reason to treat this lazy implication seriously.
Well, what about Pinkie Pie being a MILF?
You know, people have been asking me that incessantly since the finale aired as if they expected me to have some sort of existential crisis. The fact is that this is a time skip of several decades, and I have no idea what lessons Pinkie has learned in that time. She could have learned to be a less codependent person in those years for all I know. The show doesn't give me enough information to judge her older self because that's not what the episode is about, and I'm not gonna judge how she is as a middle-aged woman based on how she was as a young adult. Now stop asking. So, with all the episodes reviewed, what's my top and bottom 5 for the season? There were very few episodes that were bottom 5 material, one of which only barely made it in. So here's what I'm gonna do. She Talks to Angel is number 5, Student Council is number 4, and Drag and Drop takes slots 1, 2, and 3. As for the top 5, it's The Last Laugh, The Last Crusade, Common Ground, The Beginning and Ending of the End, and She's All Yak. Whew, this season was definitely something. And unlike last season, I mean that in a good way. When I finished off season 8, I said that I wasn't satisfied with its ending, but rather that I was satisfied that it ended. My channel has always been something that I did for fun with the excess creative energy I had left over from my primary form of creativity, making art. And between finishing season 8 and moving, my drive for videos kinda took a dip. Part of the reason why I did my Nuzlocke last summer was to shake off some of that post-move depression with something indulgent that was purely for myself, with minimal pressure because I knew no one would watch it due to it being so unlike my usual content. I say all this to make the point that season 9 made me feel the exact opposite. The further I went, the more I felt like watching, even with its one abominable blemish, and it's got me pumped for the content I have planned for the future. Speaking of which, another question you guys have been bombarding me with before the season even started was, what am I gonna do for videos once Friendship is Magic ends? And I'll tell you, after I do my top and bottom 10 episodes of the series. Bye! So what did you think of this video? Swarm that comment section below or bug me on social media. Until next time, keep it sketchy, folks.